All right, we'll go ahead and get started. My name's Gerald Austin. We've got, I think, one or two people maybe here from our section. We've got Dale Hicks, who's also he's the vice chairman, I believe. Appreciate him coming. But we're going to talk about welder qualification testing for D1.1. More of a kind of an overview of just plate welder performance qualification testing. And if there's any questions, just stop me as we go forward. I don't have all the slides done. I actually had some illness early this week, and I procrastinated and got tied up with my students both yesterday and today after school, and I'm about nine slides short of a load, but we'll go through it, and I still have the outline, and I will finish the PowerPoint up. If somebody wants a copy of it, you're welcome to it, but don't expect anything too flashy. It's hard to tell from this view, but I'm not real flashy. So anyway, brief overview and discussion of the key topics related to plate qualification testing. We're not going to really get into the stuff for the tubular. But anyway, objectives. Hopefully when you get done, you'll be able to use D1.1 to set up, administer, inspect, and review welder qualification in accordance with D1.1 2020. Just to throw it out there, there's not any changes between D1.1 2015 and D1.1 2020 as far as welder performance qualification goes. It's pretty much just like it was. It's just got new paragraph numbers or clause numbers. And hopefully another thing you'll be able to do is describe to others the fact that welder performance qualification testing is only a small part of doing code quality welding. This is something I actually do welder performance qualification testing through my company. I help companies with it. And I also do it through an AWS accredited test facility. The high school that I teach at is an AWS ATF. And I've been involved with a few other ATFs. And that number 2 is one that I run into a lot. There's a lot of wives' tales or thoughts out there that a company, in order to do D1.1 quality work, has to have their welder certified or qualified. How are you going to look at? We'll talk about that in a minute. But they think that's it, okay? And that's just not the case. And it's just a welding wives' tale, okay? You know, for those of you that do know, put up with me. That for those of you that don't know, D1.1 we'll say is that thick. There's that many pages in there about welder performance qualification testing. So it is not the all magic, oh, we're complying with the code now because we've got our welder certified. But hopefully that'll be something you'll be able to do after we get through here. So the topics kind of overview, you know, what is welder qualification testing? Well, likely everybody's pretty familiar with it. What is certification? This is kind of related to an ongoing discussion of qualified versus certified. And we're going to just look at what D1.1 says. The D1.1 responsibilities for welding testing, who can do it, that type of stuff. What do you need to perform the testing? Test types, mainly just talking about grooves and fillets. And what are some of the variables? That's about where I got to as far as the slides go, but that doesn't mean we'll stop talking necessarily there. We'll talk a little bit about the acceptance criteria and the paperwork. Before we get started, does anybody have any specific questions about welder qualification testing, something that they've, as far as D1.1 goes, or any other code? There's a few I'm familiar with, but something that you're kind of hoping we address in the meeting? All right. And you can also always, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it doesn't have to be addressed during this meeting, but I'd like to get opinions on one of the things we discussed last night. And that's the difference in, at least for me, and I most of my work has been in Section 9, but not using B2.1 versus qualifying welders for each individual section of the code.
Yeah.
That was just curiosity there.
All right. We'll get on with this and maybe discuss that just a little bit. I've got a few ideas. So what is qualification testing? Something that's required by D1.1 always. If you're doing any welding in accordance with D1.1, the welder has to be tested and certified, meaning somebody signed for it. There's no exceptions. There are some codes that make exceptions for people that are putting in tack welds and the tacks are going to be removed. D1.1 doesn't have that statement, for instance. It just refers to tack welders only. Doesn't talk about whether those tacks are removed or not. It's something that's misunderstood by many, kind of like I talked about at the beginning. Many folks think that this is all I've got to do to be code compliant. I've got a certified welder on the job and I'm doing everything right, that person knows everything that there is to know about welding because they're like a master plumber. And unfortunately, that's not the case. I oftentimes use the analogy of a certified welder can be a guy that can make a 2-inch long fillet weld on 2 pieces of 10 gauge, or a guy that can reach 4 tubes deep in a generating bank in a boiler and look through the gap and put a root in and have it pass x-ray. Both of those people can be considered certified welders if they've taken a test and somebody signed for it on paper. That's certified. It's something very easy to do. It's not rocket science. There's a lot of companies out there that think it's necessary for me to hire a consultant or a specialist. And, I hate to give that away because I do make, I make some good money doing this, but I'd rather teach them to fish than do the fish for them. Now, everybody's got some different opinions on that, and I understand it. But if you've got a code book and you've got the ability to understand it and some pretty minor pieces of equipment, you can do it on your own. There's no need to have an outside party come in. And as a matter of fact, the norm as far as D1.1 is concerned is the company's required to do the testing or responsible for it no matter what. But it is something that requires records. You can't just say, my welders are qualified, I've tested them. There's a requirement to have those records on hand. This is kind of related to contractors that I've run into in steel erection, saying that they're using a pre-qualified procedure because they're following the requirements in clause 3 or clause 5 of D1.1 now. And they're saying, we're just doing it as a pre-qualified. Well, you've still got to have a document. Same thing goes for a welder performance qualification record. That's one document you have to have. And again, something that they can do on their own usually. There are some exceptions, what I was talking about up here earlier. Even though it's easy to do, there are some times where a contract may require an outside party to witness the testing. That's not completely unusual, but it's not the norm typically. And hate to throw this one out there because this one shoots me in the wallet sometimes. It's something a CWI is not required for. There is absolutely no requirement for a CWI only to do welder performance qualification testing in D1.1 and almost any other code. The only exception to that is for an AWS accredited test facility. That's the one case where an AWS CWI is required to supervise the testing. Other than that, it's not out there. A welder performance qualification record with a CWI stamp on it is no more valid than one that's signed by the manufacturer's or the contractor's superintendent. It's no more valid as far as the code is concerned. But it is also the welder qualification test and something that can be required for the company's needs. You've got to meet, if you're going to sign a document and certify that the requirements of D1.1 were met, you've got to meet those. But if you want to exceed them, you can. When I perform welder qualification testing as an AWS ATF and an organization tells me, let me get these people clicked in here. There's 2 Tim Williams now. An organization tells me they just want me to meet the code, then there's a little bit of liberty that can be taken with the visual appearance, be it one way or the other. If the cap beads look like snake breeding, ain't nothing I can say about it. That's not in D1.1. Okay, it has specific requirements as far as what's acceptable and what's not. But when I'm testing welders for a company that I'm going to be on the job as a quality control inspector for, then I can take the requirements of that company, what their expectations are for welder quality and capabilities, and apply those to the test fine. But when I'm charging somebody to come in and take a test and all they say, I want a D1.1 test, I better be careful if I reject it because I don't think it looks good. Not saying I ain't done 1 or 2 of those because I've had some that look pretty rough and I just take pictures and document them. But it's, they're down there pretty bad. Anybody got any questions about that? All right, so what is certification? This is just, I'm sure everybody's probably seen or read statements about qualified versus certified. I try to avoid them. I've heard that thing over the years, okay? So many discussions of certified versus qualified. Look at the form that's published by AWS. So I'll click on it. See if I can get it over here on the right screen here in a second. I got to get all these faces out of my way. So you should be able to see the form. And I don't know if your screen is clear enough to see the very bottom statement. But it says, we the undersigned certify. As soon as a signature goes on that piece of paper right there, that is a certification. What is that certification for? It's for whoever's name is up here completing the requirements of this specific test as described. So therefore, that person, when this piece of paper is signed, is a certified welder. Okay, that's just the way that I see it based on the words that are in the code book. I can't change that. So what about AWS D1.1 definition? Let's see what it says besides just what it's on its form. Welder performance qualification and demonstration of the welder's ability. Okay, so welder performance qualification is what I do when I take my test. The welder certification is the written certification that a welder has produced. The weld's meeting that standard. Therefore, if I have a welder certification, I'm a certified welder. That's just all there is about it. I think in the CWI world, for instance, there's a lot of reluctance to throw that term certified out there with welders. So responsibilities for welder testing. D1.1 says each manufacturer contractor is responsible for it. No matter who does it, that manufacturer, that contractor is the one that's responsible for it. And it does give the option here, whether it's conducted by the manufacturer, contractor, or an independent testing agency. But regardless, the manufacturer or the contractor still maintains responsibility for it, and that doesn't go away. Okay, so what do you need? You need a code book. That's a big one. When I do offer to customers to help them do their welder performance qualification testing, one of the requirements is that they have to have a code book when I get there. And I will show them how to use it. I'll go through with it. I'll do their first initial test with them. I'll talk to them about creating a pre-qualified WPS that meets the requirements of their test. I'll show them how that works. So I'll teach them how to fish. And then if they need any help, I'll bait the hook for them every once in a while. But you got to have the code book. Okay. Myself, I've tested welders with various codes. I got to be careful doing things off the top of my head. So it's good for me to actually have that code with me and look at it before I get started. Okay. Now, another thing that you need besides just having the book is, of course, have an understanding of the requirements of the applicable clause. You know, D1.1 right now, it's clause 6. Last version, it was clause 4. You can just throw this out there to them, Daryl. I don't know why they can't keep all the chapters the same in the code book, but that's a whole nother story. But anyway, so for right now, for at least for the next 5 years, clause 6 is the clause about welder performance qualification testing. You got to have a welder. You got to have a WPS that meets the requirements for the test. Okay, so one of the common misconceptions that I've seen in some industries is that a welder tests to use a WPS, and they don't. They test while they're using a WPS, and that WPS has to match the requirements for the test. A welder doesn't qualify to use a WPS. A welder qualifies to use a specific set of variables in production, and when they're in production, they use a qualified WPS, but they don't have to overlap. A welder does not have to be qualified to use a WPS for its full range. And they got to have materials for the test that comply with the WPS. And the ability to perform the required inspections. And we'll talk about that a little bit if we get to it, but the requirements for the inspector are in AWS D1.1. CWI is one of them, but there's quite a few other options. And you need to have a record of the test that complies with D1.1. D1.1 has specific statements in it that explicitly require a record of welder performance qualification testing and what has to be on it. Okay. Anybody got any questions about that last slide? Sorry, I don't have any cool pictures or nothing like that. I was getting to that stage and just didn't quite make it. So test types. You know, for groove welds for plate tests, if you do a groove weld test, it qualifies for grooves and fillets. It qualifies for grooves and pipes that are 24-inch diameter or greater. and fillet welds in all pipe diameters. So the groove weld test and plate is kind of the, the go-to test that I've been, experience given. It also qualifies the welder for plug welds and slot welds. The required tests are visual, and the visual are on the root pass and the cap only. There's no requirement for you to witness the intermediate or to inspect the intermediate passes, but you can if you want to. And then for destructive testing or non-destructive testing, you've got the choice of bends or radiography. And the bends can be face bends or root bends once it's 3/8 of an inch thick or thicker, or 3/8 of an inch thick. Once it gets thicker than that, they have to be side bends. But with a 3/8 inch coupon, you can do side bends, and they're pretty easy to do. The fillet weld plate test, the fillet weld only is all they're qualified for, but it does include pipe for all diameters. So someone that does the fillet weld brake test, I guess in the dark you probably can't see my hand gestures, but anyway, someone that does the fillet weld brake test is qualified to weld on pipe all diameters for fillet welds. Okay, there are restrictions for the dihedral angle for how the pipes come together, but as far as for a fillet weld, they can do it any size. Doesn't matter. But it doesn't qualify them for plug or slot welds. But in my opinion, the fillet weld test as written in D1.1 is one of the most difficult tests to pass, in my opinion. I've failed more people on that than I have any other test. Okay, the code has failed them really. They didn't meet the requirements for penetration all the way to the root of the joint. So, it's not necessarily required. Now, there are some other codes that require welders to qualify for fillets and grooves separately. Most of the AWS codes are not that case that I've read, but I haven't read them all. But some of the mill standards did require that for military procedures. The test that's required is a VT, a visual, and then a fracture and a macro. And typically the fracture of the macro is the one that gets them. It's a difficult test to pass if you don't maintain everything pretty good. All right, so the next part was what are the variables that apply to the test? Okay, table 6.12 has them in there. And there's, of course, many footnotes, and we're going to go through some of them, but here they are listed. The process is an essential variable for performance, the F number, position, diameter, the progression, whether it be uphill or downhill, backing if it's used in the test, and multiple electrodes for semi-automatic or machine operators. But if you are going to start doing your own testing and you're going to start using D1.1 for the welder qualification testing and use it in general, make sure you always read the footnotes. Okay. So here's a statement that's different than maybe say for those of you that experience with ASME with D1.1. If a person does a manual or semi-automatic process test, they're also qualified as operators. ASME Section 9 doesn't allow that. It's different. But reading through those footnotes will help you out and keep you out of trouble. In case some pain in the rear end CWI who likes to study on stuff for welder qualification comes and looks at your paperwork, because that happens sometimes. So we'll go through the first one, the process. Okay, it's only qualified for the processes used for the test. And again, GMAW short circuit is a different process than all of the other GMAW modes. But always remember, all the other modes do overlap. So if a person takes a test with globular, they're qualified for spray. If they take a test with pulse, they're qualified for globular. Now, just because they're qualified doesn't necessarily mean they can do it on the job, because they've got to have a qualified WPS to do it. But just for welder performance qualification testing purposes, the ranges that they're qualified are all grouped together for all of the GMAW transfer modes except for short circuit. The bottom one is something that some folks may not be aware of, or they don't take advantage of one or the other. More than one process can be used on a welder performance qualification test. AWS D1.1 does not have a variable for what's called deposited weld metal thickness, how much weld metal you put in a joint. The only thickness requirement that's in D1.1 for performance qualification is related to how thick the coupon was. So based on the rules in D1.1, I can take a 3/8 of an inch thick plate and I can put a pass of TIG, stick, flux core, and MIG, and boom, I'm qualified to weld up to 3/4 of an inch with any one of those processes by itself. So that's kind of a good bang for the buck if you're helping out a fabricator, and they've got welders that have shown experience and are good at welding, that kind of stuff, but nobody's ever been certified, qualified, however you want to put it. That's a way to handle it and get them a pretty good bang for the buck. But that's up to you. Okay. If somebody just puts one pass with a process at a plate, is that enough to show that they have that skill? That's a decision that the person or the organization that's administering the test has to kind of decide. But still not a bad idea to throw that one out there. Might be better to do it on the unlimited thickness. That way they can get a little bit of meat in there. But that is something that is allowed by D1.1, but you don't see it very often. Or I haven't seen it very often on welder performance qualification records. I've done, on-site surveys and audits, and they had one welder performance qualification record for stick and another one for flux core. And they could have all been done at once. Any questions? All right. So the next one, go ahead.
Just a side note on the RT, talked about bin testing. On the GMAW short circuit mode,
Yeah, can't do it.
You have to bin test those, you can't RT those.
Yep, that's true. And that's common in a couple of codes, but there's also situations in some other codes where for any of the GMAW process, side bins are required. They realize that there's an issue, with the process. But yeah, the actual norm by most codes, or the default, is bins. And then the way that the wording is in most codes, it says radiography may be substituted for bins, except for GMAW short circuit. Some folks think that radiography is the norm and bins are an option. But really, if you kind of read the way the majority of codes that have welder performance qualification requirements in it, bins are the norm and radiography is an option. And of course, the exception is the short circuit mode, like you said. So that's a good point. Another variable is the F number. Okay, that was back on the chart. Unlike other codes, for F numbers, it only applies to shielded metal arc welding, stick welding. There are no F numbers for GMAW. There are no F numbers for FCAW. Okay, they don't apply. Now, like I said, other codes, you're familiar with them. Those F numbers do exist, but that doesn't apply to AWS D1.1. Okay. And a note related to that is AWS classification doesn't apply as a variable for performance qualification. Okay, if I do my test with a 70-15, I'm qualified to weld with a 70-18 because those are both going to be F number 4 electrodes. Okay, so you've got to keep that kind of out of your head. If you've been dealing with other codes pretty regularly, it's not in there. There's no limitation. Of course, the good part about that is this: if you were to just take other codes as an example, ASME Section 9, for instance, all of the flux cord steel electrodes and all of the solid steel electrodes, they're all F number 6 anyway. They're all the same. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference whether they're for regular carbon steel 70S6 or for high strength low alloy 100S1. They're all still the same F number anyway. So the other one, go ahead.
I'd just like to ask, with regard to the filler metals, and I know the ASME adopts the AWS standards for filler metals. I've never seen a change that may be made in the ASME document. And I didn't know if anyone had ever experienced that or if it's historically just been the ASME is going to copy the AWS document and that's all there is to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with what you're talking about. I've never you know, every time I've looked at them, I've never been able to find any significant differences other than the S in the front of it. You know, they call
And that's, I've never seen any difference either, but I didn't know if that would be something that anyone has experienced, I'll say.
Anybody?
Okay, thank you.
All right. So the positions that the welder is qualified for are based on this table right here. And just like the other table that we looked at, you've got to look at the footnotes. Okay, there's quite a few of them on here. But one of the common mistakes that I'll see on welder performance qualification forms is the test position, 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, etc., is actually placed in the label or in the field or in the location that's used for the position qualified. 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G are only test positions. They're not welding positions. ASME does a better job of clarifying it. They have charts that designate where 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G stop at. And then they also show where vertical, horizontal, overhead stop at. D1.1 doesn't address it quite the same, but the welder qualifies for a position such as flat, horizontal. So my point is, like I said, you'll see welder performance qualification records that tell you that the welder is qualified to weld in the 3G position. Well, the welder is actually qualified to weld in the horizontal position, the vertical position, and the flat position, even though he took his test in the 3G. The test position is essentially vertical or essentially overhead or essentially horizontal, whereas the actual vertical position, you know, varies from so many degrees this way to so many degrees that way, and I can't tell you what they are off the top of my head, but the charts in the code books do have them. But make sure that you understand the differences between these positions, and also notice this is part of the reinforcement for the fact that a welder is also qualified to weld pipe doing a plate test on a groove. If I come over here they did a 1G test. Their plate positions qualified, we don't care about. Production pipe welding qualified. Fillet welds, they're qualified to do flat and horizontal fillet welds on pipe. Notes B and E apply. I'm sorry, notes D apply. And it just gives you the dihedral angle restrictions, and that's it. So, to get the most bang for your buck, when you are documented on your welder performance qualification record, realize that the welders are if they do a groove weld plate test, they're qualified for all diameters of fillet welds. Now, you don't have, if you're the company, you don't have to allow that. If you want them to do a specific test for doing fillet welds, you can. The code is a minimum requirement. You as a company, add whatever to it that you think is going to help your company do a good job. So another variable is the thickness and the diameter. And these are based upon the tests that are done. Okay, so if they do a groove weld on the limited thickness, these are the two figures for them. Test plate's 3/8 of an inch. It also tells me what bends I have to do, but it also tells me what the minimum and the maximum thickness are the welder's qualified for. Notice there's no reference to different processes. Okay, so that covers the thickness right there. Anybody got any questions about what we talked about so far? So one of the other variables that there's sometimes some confusion on is backing. Okay, backing can be backing, putting something behind the joint to support it. It can also be a backing weld, where you put a weld bead on the back side of the joint first, and then you weld the other side of it. Or it can be back welded, meaning you weld the front side of it first and then go on the back side. Those are all, as far as welder performance qualification goes, considered welding with backing. There are some, there have been cases where people have had issue with someone going in and doing the initial root pass on a joint with no backing, and the inspector thought that they weren't qualified. But the plan was, and the way the WPS was written, was to go back gouge it on the other side.
Is there not specific requirements for backing size if it's going to be RT instead of bend?
There is. So if you're going to do radiography, there's a requirement for a 3-inch minimum width. That's in section or in D1.1. Other codes don't necessarily address that. But yeah, that's the requirement for doing the radiography. And you can, for the bends, you can use either or. But essentially, like I said, the main thing to understand is without backing means the root pass is made and the backside isn't touched. Okay. When I give a test, that means you don't even file it, you don't grind it, you don't do nothing to it. It's as welded on the root side of the joint. And acceptance criteria, that's about as far as I got with my slide, but we can overcome it as long as AWS don't put me in jail right here. Okay.
I think Daryl had to leave for a minute, so we're okay.
Okay. Because I've got a legally purchased copy of the code book here. Just so happens. If I can manipulate all these little faces on my screen and get them out of the way where I can see. So, and you'll have to forgive me for the scrolling. So one of the things that's that you got to keep track of in D1.1 is the fact that the acceptance criteria for welder performance qualification is the same as it is for WPS. They get 6.10. Yeah. So we'll look at what it is for WPS, and it's got the visual inspection for groove welds, cracks, craters, so on and so forth. So you can read through all that. Most everybody should understand it. But these acceptance criteria right here are not the same as it is for a production weld. The production weld acceptance criteria doesn't apply to a welder performance qualification test. Okay, here is an example where it's tighter. Undercut shall not exceed a 32nd of an inch. You know, for production welds, there are cases where undercuts allowed deeper than that. Okay. But this acceptance criteria isn't necessarily, it doesn't come out and jump at you that this is the acceptance criteria for welder performance. So when you get down to part C, which is performance qualification, it tells you all of the charts and everything that we just looked through. Qualification test required, and here's where it says visual inspection. See 6.10.1, that's the WPS requirements. Same thing goes for the face, root, and side bend requirements. Use the WPS. Macro etch for performance, it is listed differently here, and also the fillet weld brake test. But the main thing that I want to make sure you know that is you shouldn't apply the production acceptance criteria to welder performance qualification testing. You know, because you may actually accept something that's not acceptable based on what the code says, or vice versa.
Gerald, can I interrupt you?
Yeah, please. Because I'm running out of stuff to say here since I run out of slides. I'm winging it now, man.
Actually, one of my guys is trying to get on. I think he's waiting for you to invite him in. He lost his connection.
Well, I had somebody pop in and said they were in the waiting room. Then when I clicked on it, the waiting room was empty.
Okay. Can you try?
I'm gone now.
Oh, are you? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good deal.
That was it? Okay. So the welder qualification acceptance criteria is different than production, main point, but it is in the code book. You need to be familiar with it. Go ahead.
Gerald, what's the requirements for the type acid? I've heard some discussion go on about what type acid, what strength, and how to neutralize it as far as micro etch. I know D1.1 don't spell it out.
D1.1 is completely silent, and it doesn't reference I can't remember what the other standard is for AWS for destructive testing, but it's completely silent. You know, where the ASME has the etchants in the back of it, tells you what's done. D1.1 just says etched. So let's look and see what it says now. They may have changed it, but I don't think so. just a suitable solution shall be used for etching and give a clear definition of the weld. And that's all that it requires. So what I do is either, a nitric acid etch, or if I'm doing them at the school, good old cleaning vinegar overnight. And the students got to wait on them. Because it'll definitely give a clear definition of the weld. It's just not very instant. That kind of help you out. There's,
Yes. Thank you.
like I said, there's a lot of differences between, D1.1 and Section 9 for sure, and a lot of other codes, and it's easy to let them overlap. And there's also, it's easy to assume that, that one of them is more stringent than others. And in some cases that's true. In some cases that's not true. Well, you've done the welder qualification test, and it doesn't get any easier than meeting the visual acceptance criteria of Section 9. If you were to just go by it by itself, it's easy. It's almost embarrassingly easy. And I think they're talking about changing it, but I don't think they have yet. But essentially it has to have full penetration, be fused, and can't have any cracks. It has to be filled to the joint. There's no acceptance criteria for undercut in ASME Section 9. There's no acceptance criteria for reinforcement, for overlap, for any of those things, for performance qualification. Whereas in D1.1 there is. The acceptance criteria for the bends in D1.1 is more stringent than it is in Section 9. But in Section 9, on the other hand, for a plate welder to get qualified in all positions, they've got to do a 2G, 3G, 4G. D1.1, they've only got to do a 3G and a 4G. It's kind of crazy that all these different code committees have come up with different ideas about what I do with a stick rod, but they just do.
I had to get welded.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I had to get welded with the rebar before, and I had to do what they call because they drilled a core hole into a column, they made me sit down in front of the rebar just like I'd be doing it out in the field,
Oh, really?
We did 2 or 3 different type of tests, and one of them we had to bevel the rebar, put like a little runoff tab on. And then the first rod I did was a 332, and I had to bend it and put a 1/4 inch weld on the back of it. Come back and then clean it from the front side, where around, 1.5 inch pipe came down and like rebar. And I had to do 3 tests like that,
Huh.
And then I'd come on this side and then the back side of it, and then on the front side, I'd do a little weld, clean it off, clean it off. Then when I did the test, I think they pull 110 and one pull 114. Tensile strength test is how they do it, the big,
Yeah.
And Pittsburgh testing in Nashville did it down there. And then I had to go out there in the field, but I had to have a CWI with me the whole time I done it to take and make sure I done each procedure right. He sat there the whole time, and I had to do a few of these columns because they took a core charge of it. A core sample. And they just drilled through the column, so they drilled through the structural reinforcement, which is rebar. So I had to do a procedure just like that, Oh man, that was one of the toughest tests that I ever had to do as a welder, And it was but when they came back, I had to grind the face of the rebar down. He took his little machine and went through there and tested everything.
That's one of the things that I try to explain to people sometimes. What we see in a code book is a minimum requirement. And, engineers and designers and all those people, they make the decisions on where you've got to go over the code. And Curtis and I were talking about this last night, root oxidation. Did you ever look into the root oxidation question?
I did, and there are no acceptance criteria in B31.
Now, B31 codes, if a guy was to do a welder performance qualification test with a purge, and he had some root oxidation on the root, there's nothing I can reject it by. It's not in there. Now, if he did that test in Section 9 with a purge, he's only qualified to weld with a purge. But there's no way by the code alone that I can reject it based on root oxidation because there is no acceptance criteria for that. It's weird. So that's where engineers, designers, owners write their project specifications to put in all the stuff they really need to get it done. An AWS code or any other industry code or standard, in my opinion, is not a good quality control system for controlling welding by itself. If you don't have a written quality system in place and people to manage it and supervise it and comply with it, it's just a code book. You know, that's my opinion. Any other questions on the acceptance criteria?
If you would, roll to the table for welder qualification, well, positions qualified for welders for the tubular products.
Okay. Oh, all the way into the tubular section, or are you talking about just where it refers to it?
Just where it refers to it.
Let me zoom out a little bit.
Okay, that's the plate.
Yeah, well, here's the it's not one table anymore. They've now put it in a whole other clause, which we weren't going to get into. We can
Yeah, well, I asked the question because if I'm not mistaken, the version that I've got shows that to weld a coupon and a 6G and be qualified for all positions, that you have to have the restrictor ring on there, which would be the 6GR.
Okay, that's okay.
And my understanding is that that's a misprint, and I didn't know if anyone was familiar with that.
Let's see what it is. I just bought this version. You rotate counterclockwise.
Curtis, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Gerald, correct me if I'm wrong, but the restricting ring, if you weld it with a restricting ring, puts you able to do a TKY. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Without the restricting ring, you can't. You're not qualified for a TKY. Correct.
That I understand, but I thought I had seen in a version. I saw a version, I'll say, of D1.1 that said you couldn't weld, or you weren't qualified to weld in all positions if you didn't qualify in a 6G with the ring. If you qualified without the ring, you weren't qualified for all positions.
Okay, so here's the actual chart. So if my test position is a 2G, 5G, or a 6G, we'll see what footnote F says. And that's just reference to backing. So if I take a test with a 6G, qualified for flat, vertical, and overhead.
I've been told that that was a misprint. Now, I don't know if that is the gospel. I didn't know if anyone knew.
Well,
I've never heard that before.
If you'll notice, for the 6G only, each one of these lines works together.
Right.
It only lists flat, vertical, and overhead.
Right. And I've been told that should be all. And I don't know that that's the gospel. I need to contact AWS and verify that. That was just something that came up the other day.
Yeah, that's I would if you would have asked me what it was allowed, it would have been all if it was a 6G only. And it looks like across the board it's flat vertical overhead and flat vertical overhead.
Right. And I'll put in a word and find and see what I can find out. Maybe I'm sure maybe I've heard wrong, but if whatever I heard, I'll let everybody know.
Yeah, I downloaded this one from, well, I don't know if they've done a second printing yet or not, but I downloaded this one just the other day, my electronic one that I bought. And maybe they don't update them when they, I don't know if they do the second printings with the electronic ones when you buy them or not. I would think if they did a second printing electronically, you get it for free, but that's a whole nother story.
Right.
But anyway, so anybody got any other questions about what we've covered so far? And don't feel obligated to stay here any longer, but I do have a few more. I got a few more topics here on the presentation.
I've got one question that's completely off subject.
All right, lay it on me, or on whoever.
D14.1. I got a call this evening from a gentleman that has got some stainless steel components that they want to use as part of a lifting device. and they want to preheat, and I can't remember the parameters, but it's basically to preheat in such a way as to make sure that it retains the dimensional capabilities. And I didn't know about the preheat of stainless and its relationship to a lifting device, or if the AWS considered that.
Don't give me the line.
Okay, well, I'll take the silences, and nobody knows too much more than I do about that one, but
No. Let's see if I can get this up here.
For one, if it's going to be a lifting device, then it'll have to be certified as such by an engineer.
So the only other thing that I had, one of the last topics, we talked about the acceptance criteria, was the paperwork. You know, AWS keeps their forms online as PDFs if you want to use them. It's pretty easy. Okay, there's not necessarily any instructions for how to fill them out. However, there are examples in the back of the code book. Oh, let me view that and flip that around. One more time. One more time. Yeah, I know I went backwards. All right. There we go. Oh, you in here. Can't ever remember whether the appendixes are at that have it, but we'll see it flash by here in a second. So they have sample forms in the back of the code, some of which are filled in with examples of the information that's needed. Now, these are not, they're not real forms as far as something you can just take and go use and guarantee that they're right, because some of them may have some data in them that is not necessarily correct and true. Get to the one for the welder, though. So here's an example of the welder performance qualification record. It doesn't have to be in this format, but what D1.1 does require is that every variable for performance qualification is recorded. Okay, so every variable that's in welder performance qualification information in clause 6, part C, has got to be on this form. Doesn't have to be in a form type format. You could write a paragraph that says, Gerald Austin welded a 3/8 inch thick A36 welder performance qualification test using figure 6.20 or whatever it is, using E7018 F number 4 in the horizontal position with a backing strip, and he's qualified for blah, blah, blah. And you could write it out as a paragraph. It still meets the code. Okay. It's not what people are used to seeing, but it can be done. Oh, you have to go ahead.
If the F numbers are non-essential, then why are they listed on the form?
Because they are essential for shielded metal arc welding. They're just not essential for other processes. So if you notice down here for F number under this one on the example, GMAW, it's just left as a blank.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so the form, and that's one of the reasons, you could customize your own form and probably get 2 or 3 welder qualifications on one page, to be honest with you. Because there's a lot of extra space in there, to put things in. But the forms that are in there kind of give you an idea on what goes where. Here's when I fill out the welder performance qualification test record, the type of test, I'll refer to the specific paragraph, the figure number, that type of stuff. That way there's a clear record of what I did. Here's a case where somebody put in discontinuity that was in the bend test. It's not required to be there. You can make remarks if you want to, but there's no required. But I do have to record whether they're acceptable or not. Another difference where where I don't necessarily do what this sample form does is filler metal spec. Okay. There's no qualification range for filler metal specification. I can leave that blank if I want to. Same thing goes with AWS classification. I can either put in all D1.1, or I could leave it blank. There's no way that my paperwork could be rejected based upon the requirements of the code if I left that blank, because it's not applicable. Okay. Basically, any GMAW filler metal that I use, if I'm using it in accordance with D1.1, I'm qualified to use. But again, for the ease of getting through auditors, you may want to fill that stuff in. It's up to you. Or who knows, you may want to leave one of them blank and throw them a bone. That way they can feel they got something done when they looked at your paperwork. Okay. Here's something that's a little misleading. In this example form, they had the welder do a 2G, 3G, and a 4G to get qualified for all positions. A company could very well do that. That might even be a good idea, because sometimes a 2G test can be quite a pain. But if you were to just go by this as an example and not go actually look at the tables and the charts that apply to the performance qualification, you could think, well, you got to do that. It shows right here that that's what they did. That's not the case. And so there's a lot of different ways to handle it. Like I said, I use the PDF forms. I use a database that I wrote, and then I also use the C-Spec software. It's kind of nice I use it for the WPSs. So one of the things that I was going to mention, if anybody wants a pre-qualified WPS for welder performance qualification testing for D1.1, I'll be glad to put your name up here, let you tell me what other additional information you wanted. But basically the WPSs are essentially set up just for welder testing. And I've got notes on here about how we do them at our test facility, but I've got the joint design in there, and I've got the requirements of AWS D1.1. And that way the welder has got that information there right at his fingertips for the most part. And then I also put notes in about the test that are just related to it. But if somebody wants an AWS D1.1 pre-qualified WPS, I've got one for shielded metal arc welding, gas metal arc welding with 9010, and flux core with E71T1. And and for me to change it, or me to make one with your letterhead on it, it's a 5-minute ordeal, and that's it, top. So if you need help, just so you have one to do your own welder testing with, do it. But I would ask that if you want a WPS to do the welder testing, you would tell me that you also have a code in your possession. Okay. Because that's really much, that's all part of it. Just having a WPS and just doing a welder test, you really need to have the code book. Okay. And that really kind of wraps it up for the most part. If anybody's got any questions, I'll be glad to talk about it. You just got to know when to tell me to shut up.
Question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
On the ATF, when you bring a welder in for weld test, what weld procedure do you use? Is that predetermined, or that is for whatever company you're certifying for, or is that just an SWPS?
It can be either or. So if a company wants me to do the welder testing for them, they provide a WPS. If it's an individual walking in off the street, then we'll use one of our WPSs. Or if they bring one that's qualified, then I can use it. The SWPSs, I don't use a whole lot. I've got the 2 pipe ones and 1 GTAW plate one that I purchased that I'll use on the cases where somebody will come in and want to do those tests. But for the most part, for D1.1, pre-qualified WPSs are pretty down and dirty for the most part, unless somebody wants to do short circuit. And I've explained to companies that I've gone to, and they've said we want our welder certified. And I go see what they're doing, and they're all welding short circuit mode. I'll explain to them that the test that I can give them is not going to qualify them for what they're doing.
So what you're saying is, if you produce a pre-qualified weld procedure and you test him on that, just say it's a stick electrode, he goes out on the job site for another contractor. Are you saying he's qualified to weld with their WPS?
Yes. Yeah. What WPS you use doesn't matter. you know, the engineer of record for the D1.1 project has got that option to accept welder testing from another organization. So that's one of the, you know, the deals that's going to be project specific. But when a welder goes out on the job, regardless of what WPS he used for testing, he's got to have a WPS for the production welds.
Correct.
There's no linking between the performance qualification WPS and the WPS that's going to be used in production. So the welder is qualified regardless of what WPS he uses in the future, and even who issues it. There's nothing that prohibits that in D1.1 and in any other codes other than, you know, ASME Section 9 is specific because the manufacturer, the contractor, has to do the testing. So that one's kind of a, you know.
Yeah, this got brought up on a job site. We had a welder certification that was generated using the forms, and actually had on the form still had the WPS. What was it?
Oh, from the sample
on there. We're
yeah.
like, I'm not sure that you actually qualified him with the WPS.
Yeah.
So this was actually one of the schools that did this, and I was trying to get a hold of the welding instructor at that school to kind of tell him what he needed to do.
Yeah. And one of the things that I do is I give a copy of the WPS that's used for testing to the welder if he wants it. And just in case, you know, and I'll videotape or I'll take pictures and stuff, you know. Typically if I'm doing them on my own, not as an ATF through the ATF, I videotape them myself. But yeah, I want to, you know, because there's shady things happening out there. That's just all there is to it. You know, some of those things are shady because people are trying to get by with something or cut corners. Some of them are because of a lack of knowledge. You know, they don't really know. But I'll give the welder the actual WPS, and of course I've got a note on it right here on the top, which could easily be whited out. But again, it's, you know, it's just for welder performance qualification tests, and that's the WPS that they followed when they did the welding. And you know, they can, I guess, be a little bit more validated if they want to, or if somebody wants to question them, they can, you know, say, this is what I had, this is what I followed when I did it. But like I said, if somebody needs one and you're trying to get your own welder testing going or something like that, and you need help with a pre-qualified WPS, you know, I can do that without much issue.
Yeah,
I really wish, and there's also some that have been published on the AWS member network, that there's a gentleman that wrote a book that is an awesome, you know, an awesome set of pre-qualified WPSs. And if you get on the member network and look for pre-qualified WPS, it's not just a 1 or 2 page WPS, though. It gives you good, valid instructions for, you know, actually really controlling the welding. Again, a WPS by itself.
I've used the C-Spec program. Matter of fact, I was involved in helping with the NDT forms when they were doing that. And
oh yeah, you know Nick. Then I worked for C-Spec for a couple of years. I was a customer service representative working out of my living room.
We ended up going with CEI.
CEI, did you? Yeah, I worked for C-Spec for a while, and then we got put together because of the database stuff that I had on one of my websites. So I, you know, made my own because I was too cheap to buy that stuff. And then so I started, you know, working for them, and I got to learn a lot. You know, it was enjoyable to listen to the different problems that people had with, you know, you'd think it was with the software, but really the majority of it was with the actual understanding of the applicable code and what it said or didn't say. You know, they would call in and say, well, this, you know, this keeps telling me that this guy's qualified for all diameter socket welds. I said, well, they are. You know, and we'd go through the code. So it was a great learning experience for me. But yeah, one of the ways I do it, I've got the database that just has the welders entered. And then I've got specific weld test details entered, and then it just matches both of those together. And
our biggest issue is people call in and say, I want to be certified.
Yeah.
course, the next question is certified to do what? We can give you a well test, but that's not going to make you certified to be able to do what your company's doing. So
Yeah.
we got to figure out what you need.
I've probably spent more, well, not more, but I've spent a lot of hours talking people out of welder qualification and certification by going that route than you would imagine, because and that's what I do is I'll ask, what do you make? What do you build?
Exactly.
You know, we build tent stakes. I said, well, do you advertise your tent stakes as being built in accordance with any industry code or standard? No, we just got this drawing. Well, let me see the drawing. The drawing just says weld it there. You know, and by the time we get through it, you know, and that's when I refer to AWS B2.1. I said, well, if you would like to say that your welders are certified to something and you're not doing your manufacturing to a code, then B2.1 is a good way to go. It's, you know, that way you're just saying that my welders are, you know, they pass a specific test, that kind of stuff. It's, there's a lot. I've got an actual web page that is called the certified, it just says the certified welder, and it talks about some of those, you know, some of those discrepancies or wives' tales or whatever it is, you know, that I've run across over the years. You know, I did special inspection up here in Northeast Tennessee for a year and a half or something like that, and it was a big eye opener. But I actually went to at least 2 contractors where, when I looked to review their welder performance qualification records, they told me that, here, this is the one for our certified welder. I said, well, he's not the guy up there welding. No, but he's on site whenever he's welding. So they actually were under the impression that if a certified welder was there, that they were good to go. And
Certified well inspector was in his truck.
yeah, my dog went to the yard of a guy that used to know somebody that welded, and I'm qualified, man. Wow. But you know, there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of things to do about it. You know, I've made some tremendous mistakes. I went back and looked at welder performance qualification records. I first started testing welders or getting involved with it when I was in the Navy. So it was back in the mid 80s. So we did all mill standard 248, 250, you know, all kinds of different stuff. And I was the qualification petty officer. So that's when I started looking into codes and seeing what the rules were and that kind of stuff. And basically trying to give inspectors a hard time is how I got started doing QC altogether. But as I you know, progressed, and, you know, I worked for a boiler contractor when I first got out of the Navy, and got familiar with ASME, which was, you know, an eye opener in and of itself. You know, it became apparent that a lot of things were missed. And then when I went back, you know, and I noticed that back then when I was doing it, I was finding these mistakes and those mistakes. But now I've gone back and I've looked at old welder performance qualification records that I've filled out, and I find mistakes on them. You know, it just happens. You know, there's so much stuff to learn, and it's so easy to overlook it. That's why it's good to have a group of people to look at things and you know, decide whether it's right or whether it's not. If you've never been on the AWS forum, it's a great place to put your dirty laundry and have folks tell you about it. And they'll help you clean it up.
That's good information.
But like I said, if you know, if I can help somebody, I'd be glad to. You know, there's a whole lot of different aspects to the welder qualification testing that I've never even dealt with in D1.1. You know, I've done some D1.3, D15.1 for the railroad code, 1.6, and, you know, that kind of stuff. A little bit of D1.2, which is it's an adventure. But overall, it really is all about just getting the applicable code book and looking through it, you know, finding out what it says and not making any assumptions about what they did on the last job, or what, you know, what you think is good because they told you in CWI school that it was good to not have a weave bead. You know, you got to look at what the actual requirements are and just follow those. Let's see if I can find this. But
Everyone have a good evening.
hey,
Yeah,
Dale, I
okay.
appreciate
While
you
y'all
coming
are
hang out
looking,
with me.
Dale, Marion, Bob, David, and everyone else that commented, thank you.
Yeah.
There was there in the chat, there was a couple of people asking if they could get Gerald's contact information.
Okay. Yeah. Let me put that on there right there.
Bill, you still got that Victory motorcycle?
Yeah, I've got 2 of them now and 1 Indian, and I'm gonna collect a few more here probably in a couple years.
Cool.
Still trying to get out as much as I can.
Hey guys, I got to dip out. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to see if I can get in touch with you, Gerald, to maybe do a small write-up for the magazine, because I thought this was pretty intuitive. So I guess I can get your email address, shoot you an email, and maybe you can send me some slides of something what we just talked about,
Yeah,
and then I can do a small write-up.
I'll try to finish the presentation and make it better, but I procrastinated pretty good. My poor little
Thank you.
health ain't been what it's supposed to be, so I kind of put everything off to the last minute, thinking I was going to all of a sudden feel better the last 2 days, and that wasn't the case.
I got you. Yeah, but I'd love to do some kind of write-up, just because, to be honest with you, I don't think a whole lot of other people are actually meeting, and I think we're kind of, I think it'd be pretty recognizable that we're actually still putting forth the effort and having meetings when a lot of them, I'm sure a lot of other sections are just not even meeting. So
yeah.
We can kind of shine the spotlight on us for doing this, and I want to try to take advantage of that. So
yeah, I'm hoping, and I've dropped the ball as a section chairman here and for the Holston Valley, and I didn't even schedule a meeting for July, and I've really not even got anything figured out for February, but I'm still up in the air about whether we're going to try to get together face to face, because there's so many people hesitant to do it. I don't know whether it's a good idea to even put out there yet. So I'm struggling with that just a little bit in and of itself. But this is actually a really good, I've done 2 or 3 of these online meetings with our section, and this was a good turnout. So, I'm surprised there weren't a few more people from our section here. I see somebody there.
I'd like to comment real quick if you can, but Bob, Heath, Eric, Kyle, and David with the Nashville section, those guys do a heck of a job supporting our section, and I want to say thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to I see somebody's name, Barry Jackson. Are you a Barry Jackson that I know that was with the NDT company in Memphis?
You already off?
I don't know. I'm still here.
I don't know if Barry may be off.
Okay, I see his name there, and it's a familiar name to me. That's who I'm thinking it was, but
He just unmuted, so you may be trying to figure out how to get his microphone working.
Gerald,
yeah.
the Barry Jackson that's on here, he must be done wrong. But you met him at the Nashville section where we eat pizza. If you remember, he had on overalls like you did.
Okay.
He's from Jackson Welding Consulting. He's from Glasgow, Kentucky, Gerald.
Okay. Yeah. All right, that's not the one I'm thinking about then.
Yep.
All right. Well, like I said, if y'all ever need anything I can help you with, I'm by no means an expert in this. I tell folks, don't confuse my enthusiasm with skill or ability.
Okay. Was you referring to Bill Jackson in Memphis?
Bill Jackson, that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
If y'all have got any thoughts before we break up, if y'all have got any thoughts on anything you'd like to see or hear about, send a message out to Gerald, myself, and, I appreciate Gerald's sharing his knowledge with us and appreciate everybody being here. Daryl Gashler from the AWS headquarters is with us tonight. And man, it's just awesome that you've joined us tonight, all of you. I just want to say thank you, of the group too.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you coming too, Daryl. Everybody really, like I said, I enjoyed it. I could sit here and run my mouth though to nobody probably. I was telling Curtis earlier, my wife has probably heard me talk about welder performance qualification testing more times than she cares.
Hey, I just want to say thanks, Gerald. Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, Curtis together.
All right, David.
And thank Darrell for joining us tonight. These 2 cats here, they do a great job. And
if somebody wants it, I'll have the video. I'll save it and download it here when the meeting's over. Be pretty large. I think I'll be able to put it on a OneDrive or something like that, and send out a link for anybody that's interested in it. And then, of course, through that we have kind of a verification of who was here. I don't know if that works for online meetings, Darrell, for the roster, but that probably do pretty good. All right.
Sounds like it might.
Thank you,
Anybody got anything else?
thank you, gentlemen.
Thank y'all.
Thank you
I
all very
appreciate y'all
much.
hanging out with me. Take care.